And good evening, one and all. This is the X Zone. I am Rob McConnell. We're coming to you from our broadcast center and studios in Crystal Beach, Ontario, Canada. If you'd like to send me an email, xzone at xzoneradiotv.com, on all social media sites, Xzone Radio TV. And for the broadcast schedule of the X Zone Broadcast Network, visit www.xzbn.net. And for the X Zone TV channel on SimulTV, simultv.com. Exonation, my guest this hour is Dr. Robert Thiel, and we're going to be talking about prophecies this hour. Now, Dr. Thiel is licensed as a scientist by the state of Alabama. He is also a published scientist. Additionally, he has been a published author for over a decade on prophetic matters. Dr. Thiel has traveled the world and been to many places of prophetic interest. While he is a Christian, he also has expertise in many Hindu, Mayan, Muslim, Roman Catholic, and Chinese prophecies, which he has often been able to tie in with the biblical ones. He has an unparalleled success rate with his predictions. And joining me now is Dr. Robert Thiel. And Dr. Bob, welcome back to the X Zone. How are you, sir?
Very fine, Rob. Thanks for having me back.
How does a scientist, a licensed scientist, get into the world of prophecies?
Okay, that's interesting. No one's ever asked me that question. Well, I've always had interest in prophetic matters,
Mm-hmm.
so I guess you say personal interest.
Sure.
But it went back probably back in the early 2000s. My wife and I were traveling, and one of the times we were over in Vatican City, and I was looking at certain things there, and was equating certain things to some prophecies I heard, and I thought that perhaps I should do a bit more research. So that's basically how it started. And so because of that, I'd heard of, for example, Roman Catholic prophecies. I was raised Roman Catholic. I'm not Roman Catholic, but I was raised that way. And so I got some books on that. I got books on other prophecies, and basically was fascinated, if I could use that particular term,
Sure.
by how some of them were either the same or mirror images of one another. Let me explain what I mean by mirror images. The same would be, okay, let's say there's a Catholic and a Muslim prophecy that something is going to happen. And there actually is, by the way. Okay, we may even get to one of those. Okay, but sometimes, for example, there could be a biblical prophecy that let's talk about somebody that they say the Bible is bad. But then you could find a prophecy from, let's say, a Hindu prophecy or maybe a Catholic prophecy that seems to be talking about the same guy or gal at the same time, except they're making it sound like this person is good. So that's what I mean by mirror image. Their prophecies almost identical, but one group thinks this is a great thing, and the other people would say it's not such a good thing. And that's actually one of the things that you and I talked about when I was on a long time ago, because I read a book that had various prophecies, like, for example, the ones you mentioned, the introduction.
Mm-hmm.
And I've written books since which include various prophecies if I think they're applicable.
So how do
I don't know
prophecies...
if that answered your question, how I got into it, but anyway, I got doing it that way.
It was fine. It was fine. But how do prophecies work? How can anyone tell what's going to happen in the future?
Well, people of themselves, unless they've got some analytical or inside information, which is why illegal trading is the insider trading is illegal in a lot of countries.
Mm-hmm.
Ignoring something like that, if it's not based on something observable, for example, astronomy. You can look at the sky, and if you're great with astronomy, you know when an eclipse is supposed to happen. So we don't consider natural things like that to be prophecies. Okay, those are predictions, but those are not prophecies. As far as prophecies go, you either believe in a supernatural or you don't. If you don't, then none of it makes any difference. It's all just luck and coincidence, and it doesn't matter. But if there is some kind of a supernatural or spirit world out there, and I believe there is, then people such as myself believe that a divine being or spirit beings have some insight that we don't have. For those who've looked, for example, at the Hebrew Bible, in there, in Isaiah, God says he knows the beginning from the end, and he can tell you what's going to happen when it hasn't happened. Okay, if people believe such a being can do that, which I do, then when you start looking at the prophecies, they make a bit more sense. And then I think by looking at world events, you can also kind of align up what's going on with their before they happen. I know a lot of people are critical, for example, of Nostradamus' prophecies. And they say, well, no one knows what they mean until after they've happened. But with particular biblical ones, I believe you can know before things are going to happen. And I believe we're in the process of seeing many being fulfilled right now.
But is it a matter of perception that you, as a believer in not only the Bible, but also in the power of prophecy, is this the pareidolia effect where you're actually connecting dots that aren't necessarily there in order to have your belief come true?
No, well, I guess it depends how you word it. I don't think I'm connecting dots that aren't there, but let me give you an example.
Sure.
Probably one of the most specific ones that I've wrote down. Back in 2009, I was working on a book related to 2012 and the Mayan prophecies.
Right.
You and I talked about it a few times when I was on the air back then. I explained why I did not think the world was going to end on December 21st, 22nd, 2012. But I said that doesn't mean there's not other things that are going to happen. One of the things that I wrote, now this was kind of a, if you will, kind of connecting a dot and adding a dot that wasn't necessarily there. And this was kind of looking at world events. And that was, I wrote back in May of 2009 that because there were some issues with the United States GPS system, global positioning satellite system that people use for driving and all that kind of stuff, because there were some gaps there, that the United States looked like it was going to have to rely on an upcoming European satellite system called Galileo. Now, when I wrote this, a spokesperson from the United States Air Force said, no, the United States does not have such a problem, and no, you don't have to worry about this. Anybody who says this just doesn't know what they're talking about. Now, I actually had read a report from the United States General Accounting Office, by the way, and it thought that there was a problem. They were looking at budgets and stuff and say, look, you've got to do something. Now, you may not recall this, but I was former Air Force. I was actually in the U.S. Air Force a long time ago, 40 years ago. And so just because a U.S. Air Force spokesperson denied something didn't mean that I accepted it. So as it turns out, after I had the book published, a general from the Strategic Air Command, which is also part of the United States Air Force, went out and admitted, yes, we do have a problem with our GPS system. Then the next summer, I think it was July 31st or so of 2010, the Obama administration released something that said, yes, we are going to use Europe's Galileo system for part of our military defense. Now, I based this, and this is where there were some dots and some that were further along. I based this primarily on the fact of looking at biblical prophecies, what I thought was ultimately going to happen to Europe, a general time frame that I thought fit with other biblical prophecies, and the fact I was seeing something about this GPS thing. Now, you can read biblical prophecy, for example. You can read the Bible from the beginning to the end. You will not see one word whatsoever about the United States GPS or Europe's Galileo system. Okay? So I'm not saying that was there. But what was there was some information about a power in Europe rising up, being able to eventually take over the strongest military in the world, and that the world would marvel because of this. Well, when I looked at Europe and the United States military at the time, I said, wait, this isn't possible because the United States couldn't be taken over by Europe. And I said, well, the only way it could happen would be with technology. And then that's kind of how it all fell into place in my mind. Now, as it turns out, Europe's Galileo system is supposed to go live next year. And originally, when it was proposed, the United States and the UK were opposed to it because they thought it could be some kind of a strategic risk. But as it turns out, because of the Brexit vote, the European Union has told the UK they can't. They can use it, but not the military part. They're going to kind of keep it away from them. So that's, I guess, a little broad, as opposed to specific. But my specific deduction, if you will, from prophetic writings I read, led me to that conclusion, and that's where I came up with that one.
All right, Dr. Bob, please stand by. We've got to take our first break. In Nation, Dr. Bob Thiel is our special guest. Let me see. His website is, just a sec here, I just had it, www.cogwriter.com. That's www.cogwriter.com. And we'll be back on the other side of this commercial break as we continue here in the X Zone with yours truly, Rob McConnell. Here in the X Zone, a place where people dare to believe and dare to be heard. It's a place where fact is fiction and fiction is reality. And these are strange times. I'll be back. Don't go away. Welcome back, everyone. Dr. Bob Thiel is our special guest, www.cogwriter.com. Is being someone who deals in prophecy like being a psychic?
Not exactly. Psychics, generally speaking, believe that they've received a particular specific message from generally some kind of a supernatural source beyond, like in my situation, I'm claiming that I believe the Bible. I think God's Spirit leads me to understand certain things, as opposed to I get a particular message and go out and say.
Gotcha.
Now, I have had a couple of dreams, but they were not, and a few things where I've said that I believe that I got divinely inspired, if you will, for some stuff.
Sure.
But it's not things that would be considered earth-shattering. For example, I'll give you one personal example. Back in 2008, I was speaking with somebody over the telephone, and I told him if a particular person that he and I worked with wouldn't keep his word on certain things, I thought some bad things might happen shortly. And it turns out he didn't tell this person this thing. And then about 4 or 5 weeks afterwards, this person got hit with a type of stroke. And interestingly, a couple of years later, I wanted to talk to this person about some issue with his wife, and said that she would be affected by something in a few weeks, and it ended up happening as well. I guess a psychic might feel like that, but for me, that's happened like a couple of times. And because the results happened, then I tend to accept that somehow I was led by God to do it. But it wasn't like I heard a voice or anything. Some psychics, I think, hear voices, or they have other methods that they use in order to come up with things. Mine is predominantly based on what I see in Scripture and what's going on in the world, and kind of trying to put the two together, as well as considering other prophecies that others have written, because sometimes it's interesting. Years ago, if I could say this story, around the first time I think it was on your show, I had done a radio interview out of Sacramento, California, and the hostess had read my book in 2012. And basically said, you're talking about the Antichrist and the beast and false prophet and all this stuff. Everybody knows about all this kind of stuff, so they're all going to know when it's going to happen. And this is where I want to get into the other prophecies right now for just a moment.
Sure.
I said, well, I said, I've looked at other prophecies, and I think you're wrong. And basically what I said to her is, I said, the Chinese have prophecies about a beautiful people coming from the West. And that China is going to have a saint, but the saint's not that good of a person. I said, well, west of China would be Europe. And Chinese don't really have saints because the country is still somewhat officially atheist. And I said, I think this is a prophecy that was written in the Tang Dynasty, so somewhere around 800 AD plus or minus, that's telling them to accept this type of a leader when it comes up. And then I said, so you got 1.5 billion or so Chinese. I said, then there's Hindu prophecies. The Hindus have prophecies about a leader rising up called the Bhagwan Kalki. And they say that people need to take up arms to support this guy. And I said, well, there's about 1 billion Hindus. But then I said, then the Roman Catholics and Eastern Orthodox have prophecies about some leader that's going to rise up, destroy the English-speaking peoples, by the way, and basically take over the world for a short period of time. And I said, well, if you add the Catholics and the Orthodox together, it is over 1.5 billion. I said, start adding all these up. There's a lot of people out there who are affiliated with traditions or religions that are going to tell them something that I think is bad is going to be good. And so when such a thing happens, they're not going to understand it. And so this is one of the reasons I was really fascinated a long time ago when I started reading non-biblical prophecies and see how they tied or were sometimes, as I said, the mirror image of biblical ones.
But how many prophecies are actually just a coincidence instead of a reality or a prediction?
A lot of things. A lot of things can be coincidental.
Yeah.
I've read stuff about coincidence, and for example, if you're going to flip a coin, how many times you get heads in a row? If somebody's doing this long enough, they'll end up with a run of like 40 or 20 times you get heads in a row, which you'd think could never happen. But for this particular convergence, for example, the one I was mentioning before about a leader rising up and billions of people, according to their traditions or religions, think this is good. And the Bible warns against it. And the Bible says such a leader will deceive the whole world. I don't think that's the coincidence. Now, I don't believe that leader, by the way, has taken power yet. Okay, so it's not like that's happened.
Is this the Antichrist?
He will work with the Antichrist, yes.
Okay. So do we have any idea?
Anyway,
do we have any idea who this person is?
I've got some guesses, but I'm not certain.
Mm-hmm.
It's funny you should mention that one to me, because when I was listening to you say something when you're closing the last segment about getting an opportunity to be heard, let me tell you a story that I think you'll find fascinating.
Please.
A few years ago, this is probably, quite a few years ago, I think it was December of 2010. A magazine, I won't mention which one, a very famous magazine from Germany called me up. And I had written about a particular leader who held certain positions in Germany. He had been the economics minister and became the defense minister. And he ended up resigning because of a plagiarism scandal. And so this German magazine calls me up. They had a New York correspondent. This gal calls me up, and she calls me 3 or 4 times because they couldn't believe that an American could have possibly been writing about this guy before he had his scandal. They figured that, well, once he had his scandal, yeah, you'd know about this guy, and okay, so maybe wrote about him. And as it turns out, I started writing about this guy in 2009, and about 4 or 5 things that I said could be involved with this guy actually happened. And by the time she called me, maybe it was 5 or 6. Anyway, to make a long story short, I gave her links to articles. Now, back then, I actually was a partially paid journalist part-time for some company. I'm trying to remember the name of it. Began with some type of an examiner. I was with them for a while. And I also had some things at the Cogwriter website that you mentioned. But I wanted her to look at the ones at the Examiner to show that I didn't change these later. Okay, okay. I submitted these. I actually got paid for these articles, and so she looked at them and she looked at what I wrote and she asked me lots of questions, and they ended up not doing anything. And she said to me, "We just can't believe that was possible." I said, "Yeah, but I gave you every proof that you asked for, and more." She says, "Yeah, I know, but I talked to my editors, and they're like, no, this can't have happened." So anyway, I do appreciate the opportunity that you're giving me to at least explain some of these things that I believe will happen. Currently, yes, I'm looking at somebody in Germany, but I'm not sure yet, and I'll keep watching.
Okay, but what
more certain, I'll be more happy to go into that.
What tuned you into this person that you wrote about, that the German magazine was very interested in? What was it that happened that you said, this person here?
There's 2 things. Since you're in Canada, and by the way, I haven't been in your country for about 2 months. I was in Quebec recently. But it was actually an article in an Ottawa paper, newspaper. And the writer, indicated that this person they thought had potential. So this was in late 2009. And then what happened was somebody that I know who travels the world a lot basically said to me, "You want to look in this? Why don't you look into this guy a bit more? I think there's something with this guy." And so I started to look into him because of the two reasons. One, an article that was it was actually in the Ottawa Citizen, December 24th, 2009. I'm looking right here. I was seeing it. And then this other man who I'd known for probably 10 years told me to look into this guy.
Mm-hmm.
So I started to look into him. And then I mentioned before, I acquired various books on different prophecies. Well, I found a book that was not available on, like, Amazon. It was some independent publisher, really small, some woman who moved from Greece to the United States. And she had this book on Greek prophecies, so Byzantine prophecies. And I had her book, and she translated parts of it in English because I can read Greek, but not that well. Not real well, let's just say. And I saw many of the things that she wrote seemed to point to this particular individual. Then I telephoned her, by the way, and she had somebody else in mind. She thought it was some Spanish guy that this was talking about, and I didn't agree, but she was an elderly lady, and I was polite to her, and she gave me her responses. But I started looking at what that book said and various biblical prophecies and said, well, it could be this individual, and right now I'm just waiting. For example, before this individual had his plagiarism scandal, I had indicated that I thought if he could be the person, he was going to be, someone's going to dispute his reputation. He was going to have a problem.
Dr. Bob, we've got to take a hold here. I've got to go for my news break at the bottom of the hour. And Explanation, when we come back, more with my guest this hour, Dr. Bob Thiel. If you'd like to find out more about Bob, visit his website, www.cogwriter.com. This is the X Zone. I am Rob McConnell, and we'll both be back on the other side of this commercial break with the news. Don't go away. Bob Thiel is our special guest this hour, www.cogwriter.com. Dr. Bob, one of the books you've written is entitled, I just had it here in front of me, Donald Trump and America's Apocalypse. Is Donald Trump apocalyptic?
In my opinion, certainly. But I also thought if, for example, if Hillary would have gotten in, she would have been. But specifically, yes. I actually wrote a book, and in that book that was printed before he was inaugurated,
Mm-hmm.
I listed 20 reasons that I felt that U.S. President Donald Trump would be apocalyptic, and as it's turned out, pretty much everything that I said was going to happen has happened.
Okay, what were they?
Related to him.
What were those points, if you can give us the top five?
Okay, well, let me. This one wasn't really necessarily a top five, but
Okay.
I want to say this one anyway, and that was that he would increase U.S. debt. And the reason I want to use this one first was I did a show, and I was interviewed by somebody who was actually a delegate to the Republican convention. He had his own radio show in one of the southern U.S. states. And this is so many months after Donald Trump had gotten in office, and he said, well, I was wrong about that one. And I said, no, I'm not. And so as it turns out, the United States is now over $23 trillion in debt, and we were under $20 trillion in debt when he took office. So that was one. It may not be a top five one, but it was one that I thought was funny, particularly because somebody told me, no, he wasn't going to do that particular one. I guess one of the ones would have to do with, for example, that I felt that he would offend the Europeans and get the Europeans to be interested in developing their own separate military. So that was something that my book talked about, and specifically, in case your listeners are not aware of this, Okay, Donald Trump took office in January of 2017.
Mm-hmm.
In December of 2017, by using Donald Trump as motivation or a scapegoat, whichever term you prefer, the Europeans came up with a system called PESCO, which is Permanent Structured Cooperation is what that means, where 25 of the nations in the EU decided to get together for an intra-European military power. And
What's
so they've
wrong
been
with
working
that?
on
What's wrong with that?
since.
That's a
And
great
part
idea.
of the reason was because of Donald Trump.
So what's wrong with that?
Well, I'll say something that Donald Trump said that is logical
Mm-hmm.
and makes sense, and I'll explain why what's wrong with it.
Okay.
Now, if you don't think there's anything to prophecy, there's nothing necessarily wrong with it. Okay, Donald Trump was absolutely correct when he said that the United States spends more for NATO than all the other countries put together times 2.
That's
it might
true.
even be close to times 3.
Sure.
He was 100% if you look at what people spend on their military.
Mm-hmm.
But there's another expression you might be familiar with, which is be careful what you wish for.
Yep.
See, the belief is, once we get the Europeans to buck up on defense, and by the way, I read something today that apparently Canada and the United States have some issue about that as well, but we'll ignore Canada for this purpose, which I consider a closer ally to the United States, or a real ally to the United States, than I do the Europeans.
Well, you see, Canada doesn't charge the United States for the the Air Force bases and the military bases that American troops are on, so I think that Donald Trump was a little bit out of line when he made that statement to Prime Minister Trudeau. Now, if the U.S. wants to pay Canada rent, then I can understand President Trump's position on that. After all, if everyone else is paying 2%, why shouldn't Canada?
Right. Well, anyway, getting back to this,
Mm-hmm.
what's happened is because of statements Donald Trump has made regarding NATO,
Yeah.
Plus the 2% thing, he's encouraging the Europeans to go their own
Yeah.
way. And if you read some of the statements that some of them made, the most famously probably would be France's President Macron. He's called for a European army. He says it's got to be independent of the United States. And even German Chancellor Angela Merkel has
Right.
called for the Europeans to have a military power that will function independent of the United States. It
Okay.
isn't that they're saying they should not have NATO, but they want to have their own military power that's separate from the United States.
What's wrong with that?
And well, what's wrong with that isn't that there's anything necessarily wrong with it, unless you believe biblical prophecy points to, at some point in time, Europe getting a great army and eliminating the United States. In the book of Daniel, chapter 11, in my opinion, that's what it says.
All right.
Specifically,
What does it
the great
actually
army.
what does it actually say? I'd like to hear what the Bible says.
Okay. Well, there's two different parts of this.
Okay.
So I'm going to go to Daniel chapter 11,
Sure.
and I'll just look at it here because I'll read it verbatim.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, in Daniel chapter 11, verse 25, it says, now I'm going to tell you that he is a person who's called the King of the North, other parts of this particular prophecy. Okay, he shall stir up his power and courage against the king of the south with a great army. So that's a prophecy about this power having a great army. Now, I don't believe the Europeans have a great army yet, but for that prophecy to be fulfilled, they have to get one.
Okay.
Okay, so the fact that we're hearing talks about a European army, in my opinion, align with that. Now, the other one, though, and this one's interesting. I'm going to read Daniel 11, verse 39. This is from the New King James Version of the Bible. And what's interesting about this is actually the first or second radio interview I ever did on a book. I was asked by a former Baptist who was then Muslim, was there any prophecies in the Bible that point to the United States? People say there are. He says that I haven't heard any. So what came to mind was the next one I'm going to read, and I'll explain why I believe it's the United States. Okay, the same leader, he's called the King of the North, says, "Thus he shall act against the strongest fortresses with a foreign god, which he shall acknowledge, and advance its glory, and he shall cause them to rule over many and divide the land for gain." Well, okay, what does this mean? Well, he is this European leader called the King of the North. It would take a long time to explain why this is a European leader, but that's basically what this is.
Right.
Now, the strongest fortresses, now this is going to take some interpretation. If this is a prophecy for the 21st century, and I believe that it is,
Okay.
and I can explain why later, but I believe that it is, well, the strongest fortresses would be the country with the strongest military. And it happens to be that the strongest military is possessed by the United States of America, and to a lesser degree, it's Anglo-Saxon allies. So I believe this is a specific prophecy about the United States to be taken over.
But isn't that a stretch? Because how long ago was this prophecy written?
2,620 years ago, plus or minus.
All right, the United States wasn't even formed. It wasn't even
That's
thought
correct.
of. So
and
yet, history shows that there was a lot of turmoil within these areas in Europe and the Northern Africa, the Holy Lands. Like these people have been fighting since day one. You had the Crusades, just to mention a few, and then you had the invading forces. So looking at the time of history that this was written, I could understand that, but applying it to the 21st century, I think that's a real stretch.
Well, let me give you a couple of reasons why it's not. I don't believe it's a real stretch. Okay. Because I was trying not to read everything here.
Mm-hmm.
The next verse talks about something happening at the time of the end, and in verse 29 it says at the appointed time of the end. So people such as myself believe that the time of the end is very close, and I'll explain why in just a moment. Therefore, we do not believe this was a prophecy that was fulfilled in, let's say, 168 AD, which is what Wikipedia says, by the way. I actually looked at Wikipedia today. They don't believe this was written when it said. They believe that Daniel wrote this after these events happened, and they say this has all been fulfilled. Okay, that was Wikipedia's take on it when I looked at it earlier today.
Okay.
Well, people like myself, when we see the time of the end, disagree. There's other passages in the Hebrew Scriptures talking about the time of the end. Now, according to a tradition that is assigned to the school of the prophet Elijah, Jews anciently and early Christians believed that God had essentially a 6,000-year plan. Essentially 6,000 years after Adam and Eve left the Garden of Eden, the end would come, Jesus would return, or God would return, or come, and set up a millennial paradise. That was basically the belief. Of course, the Jews who weren't Christian didn't believe Jesus was going to come, but this was the basic belief. And I've got articles and details on how you calculate all that stuff. Well, if you look at all of this stuff, basically you're coming up to a time period somewhere in the 2020s or the latest 2030s.
Mm-hmm.
Therefore, that would be the time of the end, and so forth. At the time of the end, who's got the strongest fortresses? Well, the United States, unless something happens in the next couple of years.
But once again,
So
all I'm seeing here is a stretch. Like, what is the proof? It's nice to say, based on what I believe, what is the proof, the empirical proof?
Well, I don't know if you would consider it empirical proof, but I would say that the fact that the Europeans are openly talking about having a military independent of the United States, developing their own army, spending time on their development of their own technology,
mm-hmm.
I believe that is ancillary support for the fact that this is in the process of happening.
But that's nothing
it's not
new.
Happening
Germany,
yet, and I don't think it's not going to happen in the next couple of years either. They're not. Right. They're not ready.
Okay, but look, during World War II, Italy had its own army, France had its own army, Germany had its own army. Like, they didn't depend on the United States. The United States went into World War II and fought with these other armies. So I can't buy into that prophecy.
Okay, well, again, this prophecy says it's for the time of the end, and those of us who believe that God has a 6,000-year plan, which again would take too long to go through.
All right, listen, we've got to take our final break, so please stand by. When we come back, I have a few more questions on this because I find I find it rather argumentative, because what you're telling me is based on belief in a philosophical book that isn't universally accepted. We'll be back on the other side of this break. Don't go away. Welcome back, everyone. Dr. Bob Thiel is our special guest. His website is cogwriter.com. All right, here's where I have the problem with this entire end of the world scenario that is in the Bible. If these prophecies were written that they can pinpoint exact places and times, that's one thing. Let's put that aside for now. But the Bible is just one book of many religious philosophies. So how can we take everything that is in the Bible as fact if there are other religions out there who don't believe in what is in the Bible, and they don't even mention what is in the Bible in their religious philosophies? Now, if this was real, would the events not be mentioned in all of the religious philosophy books?
Well, according to the Bible, would be no.
But that's according to the Bible. But what about the people?
I know. Okay, I'm trying to figure out how. I'm trying to answer your questions one part at a time.
Okay,
here.
I appreciate that.
Okay. I believe, and again, you're going to call it belief again.
Mm-hmm.
I believe that I've proven Scripture to be accurate. Now, other people could look at the same facts and come up to their own different conclusions, and I understand and accept that could happen, because that does happen all the time.
Sure.
Okay. So people such as myself believe the Bible. Let me give you another example.
Okay.
I wrote a book called Proof Jesus is the Messiah. It came out several months ago. Okay. And in it, I cite a couple hundred Hebrew prophecies that the New Testament says that Jesus fulfilled. Now, a lot of people will look at that kind of thing and say, that's nonsense. The gospel writers intentionally just wrote these things down to make it look like Jesus fulfilled that. So that is an explanation. Now, I don't agree with that explanation, but that is an explanation. Mm-hmm. And that explanation itself would seem reasonable, except when you also look at, for example, prophecies that Jesus made that were fulfilled outside of the Bible. And I've not seen something like that, or I'm unaware of something like that, let's say with the Quran or some of the other religious books that you might be familiar with. So I personally believe that I've been able to prove the Bible. The Bible actually says, prove all things to hold fast what is good. A lot of people don't believe they're supposed to prove anything. They just think it's just simply blind faith. And,
well, isn't it blind?
Go ahead.
Isn't the fact that you have kept on saying, I believe, and then you'd go on to making your point. So isn't the fact that you believe that the word of the Bible is true, doesn't that come to the point that you believe unequivocally?
The answer, I think, is yes, although I'm not sure what you're actually asking.
It's very simple. All right. Let me put it as simple as I can. We know the first 4 books of the Bible were written by Moses. God did not write any part of the Bible. It was all written by man.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. And according to the Bible and those who believe, there's only one God. Am I correct?
Yes.
Then why does it say in the very first book, Genesis, and God said, "Let us make man in our image"? Why was the plural used?
Okay, I'd be happy to answer that question.
Okay.
Okay. When we believe in one God, we actually hold what's considered a binitarian view of the Godhead. We believe God is one family. Okay, which consisting of right now the Father, the Son, or
and the Holy Spirit.
No, we don't consider the Holy Spirit to be God. We are not non-Trinitarian.
But isn't it part of the God's family if you're putting that context into the us and we?
We do not. We consider that the Holy Spirit is the power of God. It was not determined by the Greco-Romans to be a for sure member of the Godhead. It's the Council of Constantinople in 381 A.D.
And there's another thing. The different councils. The Council of Nicaea, for example, when all these changes were made. How, if this is the true word of God, why would these words be changed? What was taken out? What was edited? We don't know.
Okay, well, with the particular council, according to even Catholic scholars, people of my religious persuasion were not invited to that particular council. And the decisions they made, we don't hold to them. Okay, for example, at the Council of Nicaea, one of the biggest issues was changing the date of Passover from the 14th of Nisan to Sunday. We still keep the 14th of Nisan, so we didn't accept that that council had authority from God to change anything. If that answers your question on that.
Well, yes and no. Yes and no. Because my personal interpretation of the Bible, and I've read the Bible extensively, is that it is a book that fulfilled an emptiness in the evolution of man at that time. It gave you the 10 Commandments, which are 10 basic laws. Laws that we still enforce today. The fact that Moses wrote the first 4 books, God didn't, that opens up a whole nest egg of questions. Did Moses make a lot of this up? How do we know it really happened? Wait a minute, we know it happened because we believe it did. And then when you look at God himself, like, do you have any children, Bob?
Yes.
I have 6 children. I have 12 grandchildren. And I am sure, like me, you would never harm a hair on their heads. And yet, this God, the Creator, who created all according to the Bible, he goes out and kills his own children merciless. You've got the Sodom and Gomorrah that was destroyed. You've got the Egyptians that were destroyed chasing Moses. And the list goes, and the list goes on and on and on. Now, if God was a person and God did this, he would be arrested, thrown in jail, and the key would be thrown out. My question to many scholars and believers is, how can he get away with this? How can you follow a God who kills, who breaks his own laws? That's why I do not give the Bible the credit that so many do, because it contradicts itself constantly. It's...
how do you want?
Yeah, sure, go ahead.
Okay, I don't believe the Bible contradicts itself. I also believe...
Wait a sec. Thou shalt not kill. Sodom, Gomorrah.
He didn't say he couldn't kill.
But why should he?
The Bible actually says because God was the creator, and the Bible, a couple of places say something to the effect: the piece of pottery doesn't say to the pottery maker, "Why did you do this?" or "Why did you do this?"
So wait a minute. So what you're saying is, just because God created us, he could kill us.
I believe that everything God does.
Is that a yes, or is that a yes, or is that a yes, or is that a no?
Gomorrah that you mentioned, Jesus actually said it would be more tolerable for those people in the in the ages to come than the people who were not paying attention to what he said. Thus, the Bible is teaching essentially that God had those people eliminated for their own good. Oh. They will come up later, and I believe that they will therefore actually get salvation. That's a whole other subject. But our church is a little different than ones you're probably thinking of or familiar with. We actually believe almost everybody who ever lived will be saved. And this is one of the reasons why God had certain people killed at certain times or whatever, because it would be better for them in the long run, believe it or not.
So why wouldn't that...
You and I look at our kids and say, okay, we obviously wouldn't kill our children, but we can't resurrect them, but God can.
How do we know that? That's a beautiful story. That is a wonderful story. But there's no fact to substantiate the belief.
Well, I do think there's fact to substantiate the belief. There's, I think, sufficient evidence, for example, that Jesus was resurrected.
Where's the evidence?
There were many eyewitnesses who were willing to die because of this.
Well, wait a minute, but where is the evidence? That is hearsay.
what kind of evidence do you want for what happened roughly 2,000 years ago? What for you would constitute evidence?
Well, first of all, I don't believe everything I'm told, number one. Number two,
in today's society, you better not believe everything you're told. Because a lot of people don't tell you the truth.
Exactly, including the church. I know God, Jesus said, "Suffer little children to come unto me, for thine will be the kingdom of heaven." And it seems that many priests and members of the clergy have taken that to the extreme. So come on. I think that the book was written for a time way before we actually knew what the truth about the world was, the truth about life was, the truth about science. And it was a way to try and make sense of how we were formed, where we came from, where we're going to go, what happens to us when we die. And Bob, I'd love to carry this conversation on, but you and I must say so long for tonight. And XZNation, if you would like more information about our guest this hour, Dr. Bob Thiel, visit his website at www.cogwriter.com. I'll be back on the other side of this commercial break with the news as we continue here in the X Zone with yours truly, Rob McConnell, from our broadcast center and studios in Crystal Beach, Ontario, Canada. And I know there's many of you out there thinking right now that I'm going to hell when I die. Hey, listen, you're not the first person who will think that, and you won't be the last.